Welcome to Macomb, Alabama, in the 1930s, where racism is as common as sweet tea and everyone minds everyone else's fucking business. It starts with this tomboy named Scout Finch, who's like 6 years old and narrating this whole story, which is weird, because she's telling us about shit that happened when she was a kid but with the perspective of an adult. So either she has the best memory in human history, or Harper Lee just said, fuck it, we're doing this anyway. Scout lives with her older brother, Jim, who's about 10, and their dad, Atticus Finch, who's basically the moral compass of the entire South and also probably the only white guy in Alabama who doesn't think black people are subhuman, which apparently makes him controversial as fuck. They also have this black housekeeper named Calpurnia, who basically raises these kids because their mom is dead and Atticus is busy being a lawyer and the moral backbone of the community. Cal doesn't take shit from anyone, especially not these privileged white kids, which honestly makes her the best character in the first half of the book. So, Scout and Jem spend their summers being bored as hell because this is the 1930s and the internet won't exist for like 70 years. So they have to actually go outside and use their imagination like a bunch of peasants. They become obsessed with their neighbor, Boo Radley, who never leaves his house, and everyone thinks he's some kind of monster because, apparently, if you have social anxiety in the 1930s South, you must be a violent psychopath. Makes perfect sense, right? The kids make up all these stories about how Boo eats squirrels and cats and peeks through windows at night, which is just small town gossip on steroids. Their friend Dill shows up every summer, and he's this tiny kid who's also obsessed with Boo, and the three of them spend all their time trying to get Boo to come out like he's a fucking Pokemon. They do dumb shit like run up and touch his house, try to look through his windows, and put notes on fishing poles to stick through his shutters. Basically, these kids are little assholes who won't leave this poor man alone because he wants privacy. But Boo actually seems like a nice guy, because he starts leaving them presents in a tree, like soap carvings, pennies, and gum, which Scout actually chews before realizing it came from a tree, which is disgusting on multiple levels. Kid, you don't eat mystery tree food. What the fuck? Then Boo's brother, Nathan, fills the tree hole with cement and says the tree is dying, which is obviously bullshit. He just doesn't want Boo giving presents to these kids anymore. The fact that Atticus doesn't call this out is kind of weird, but whatever. So that's the kid subplot, but the main story is about Atticus defending a black man named Tom Robinson, who's been accused of raping a white woman named Mayella Ewell. And if you know literally anything about the 1930s South, you know this is gonna end badly. The Ewells are basically white trash royalty. They live behind the dump, and the dad, Bob Ewell, is a drunk, violent piece of shit who probably beats his kids and definitely doesn't make them go to school. Mayella is the oldest daughter, and she's so poor and isolated that she makes the rest of the town look like Beverly Hills. Tom Robinson is accused of raping Mayella, which he absolutely did not do, but in the 1930s South, a black man's word against a white woman's word isn't even a contest. It's just a formality before they lynch him, which is exactly what almost happens. Atticus takes the case even though everyone in town thinks he's crazy, and suddenly Scout and Jem are getting shit from other kids about their dad being a nigger lover, which is charming as fuck and really shows you what kind of enlightened society we're dealing with here. Scout gets in fights about it because she's got a temper and doesn't understand why people are so shitty, and Atticus keeps telling her to be the bigger person and not fight, which is nice advice, but also kind of unrealistic when literal children are being racist as hell to your face. There's this whole thing where Atticus sits outside the jail to prevent a lynch mob from killing Tom, and Scout, Jem, and Dill show up because they followed him like the little stalkers they are. Scout unknowingly breaks up the mob by talking to Mr. Cunningham about his legal troubles, which makes him remember he's a human being with shame. The trial finally happens, and it's pretty clear from the beginning that Tom didn't do shit. The physical evidence doesn't match up. Mayella's story keeps changing, and Tom's left hand is completely useless from a cotton gin accident, so he literally couldn't have grabbed her the way she described. Atticus destroys their testimony. He points out that Mayella's injuries were on the right side of her face, which means whoever hit her was left-handed, and Bob Ewell is left-handed. What a fucking coincidence, right? He also gets Mayella to admit that she made advances on Tom, and when her dad caught her, she blamed Tom to avoid a beating, because God forbid a white woman admit she was attracted to a black man in the 1930s South. Better to send an innocent man to his death than deal with that shame. Tom's testimony is heartbreaking. He basically admits that he felt sorry for Mayella because her life was so shitty and he helped her with chores when she asked, and that's what led to her making advances on him. But he said he felt sorry for her, which is apparently a crime, because how dare a black man pity a white woman? The prosecutor uses this against him, and the all-white jury deliberates for a few hours, which is actually longer than usual, which shows you how low the bar is. And then they find Tom guilty because of course they fucking do. Atticus tells Tom they'll appeal, but Tom doesn't believe the system will ever work for him, because why would he? And one night he tries to escape from prison and gets shot 17 times, which seems excessive, but the guards claim he was running, so they just murdered him legally. Scout and Jem are devastated because they actually believed in justice and fairness and all that bullshit that kids believe before the world crushes their souls. This trial basically ruins their innocence forever. Thanks, Atticus. Bob Ewell is pissed off that Atticus made him look like an idiot in court, even though Bob did that himself by being a lying, racist piece of shit. But Bob decides to get revenge by spitting in Atticus's face and threatening his kids, because he's a coward who can't handle the consequences of his own action. On Halloween, Scout is dressed as a ham in this ridiculous costume for the school pageant, which is actually important later, and she and Jem are walking home through the woods when Bob Ewell attacks them with a knife, because attempted child murder is apparently his idea of appropriate revenge. Jem's arm gets broken and Scout can't see shit because she's inside a giant ham costume, which is both terrifying and kind of hilarious in a dark way. Just when Bob is about to kill one or both of them, Boo Radley comes out of nowhere and stabs Bob Ewell to death. That's right, the weird neighbor they've been obsessed with all this time saves their lives by killing their attacker, which is pretty fucking poetic when you think about it. Boo carries Jem home, and Scout finally meets him and realizes he's not a monster. He's just a shy guy with mental health issues who's been watching over them this whole time like a guardian angel who also happens to be good with a knife. The sheriff, Hecate, shows up and decides that Bob Ewell fell on his own knife because he doesn't want to put Boo through a trial. Even though Boo clearly killed him in self-defense, the sheriff knows that dragging Boo into the spotlight would destroy him, so he covers it up. Atticus initially thinks Jem killed Bob, and he's ready to let his son face the consequences because he's that committed to justice, but Scout explains that Boo did it, and Atticus understands that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing, which is a pretty heavy fucking realization. Scout walks Boo home and stands on his porch, looking at the neighborhood from his perspective, and finally understands what Atticus meant about walking in someone else's shoes before judging them, which is the whole fucking point of the book, in case you missed it. The title comes from Atticus telling the kids it's a sin to kill a mockingbird because mockingbirds don't do anything but make music for us. Tom Robinson and Boo Radley are both mockingbirds, innocent people who either get destroyed or almost destroyed by society's cruelty and prejudice. This book is basically Harper Lee's love letter to her father, who was a lawyer, and her childhood friend, Truman Capote, who inspired the character of Dill. It's also a massive fuck you to racism and injustice in the South. The crazy thing is, Lee wrote this book in 1960 during the Civil Rights Movement, and it was immediately controversial because, surprise, surprise, a lot of white Southerners didn't like being told they were racist, even though they absolutely were. Some people tried to ban it from schools because of the racial slurs and adult theme, which is ironic as hell because the whole point of the book is fighting ignorance and censorship. But sure, let's ban it. That'll solve everything. Scout is an amazing narrator because she's simultaneously naive and perceptive. She doesn't fully understand the racism and injustice around her, but she recognizes that something is deeply wrong, and that makes the story even more powerful because we're seeing this horror through innocent eyes. Atticus Finch became like the gold standard for moral lawyers, even though he loses the case, because he fought for what was right even when it was hopeless and unpopular, which is basically the definition of integrity. But some modern critics argue that Atticus is a white savior figure and that the black characters don't have enough agency in their own story, which is a fair point, because Tom Robinson doesn't even get to testify in his own defense properly and Calpurnia kind of disappears halfway through. The book also doesn't really address what happens after. Like, okay, you've shown us racism is bad, but what's the solution? Atticus tells his kids to be empathetic, but that doesn't change the system that murdered Tom Robinson. Still, this book is required reading for a reason. It forces you to confront uncomfortable truths about American history and human nature, and the fact that good people can exist in evil systems while still benefiting from those systems. The relationship between Scout and Atticus is genuinely touching. He treats her like a person, not just a kid, and he encourages her to think for herself and question authority, which is pretty radical parenting for the 1930s, or any time, really. Jem's coming-of-age arc is brutal. He goes from believing in absolute justice to understanding that the world is complicated and unfair, and watching the innocents die is painful as fuck. And Boo Radley's arc is perfect. He goes from being the monster under the bed to being the hero, and Scout realizes that all the stories she made up about him were wrong and that the real Boo is just a lonely man who needed kindness, not fear. The scene where Scout stands on Boo's porch at the end and sees the whole story from his perspective is one of the most beautiful moments in American literature. Fight me on this. This book tackles racism, classism, domestic abuse, mental health, sexual assault, and the corruption of innocence, all in like 300 pages. The Mockingbird symbolism is heavy-handed as hell, but it works. Tom and Boo are both destroyed or nearly destroyed by people who should have protected them, and the real sin isn't killing a bird, it's destroying innocence, whether that's Tom's life, Boo's peace, or the children's faith in justice. Maycomb itself is a character. It's this suffocating small town where everyone knows everyone's business and nobody can escape their reputation or their family's history. That social pressure is what allows racism to thrive, because nobody wants to be the one to stand up. The trial scenes are still powerful as hell even though we know how it ends. Watching Atticus dismantle the prosecution's case and knowing it won't matter because the jury has already decided based on skin color is enraging in the best way. This book is depressing as fuck, but it's also hopeful because Scout and Jem learn empathy, and that's supposed to be enough to change the world one generation at a time, which is optimistic but also kind of naive, because here we are, 90 years later, still dealing with the same shit. Anyway, To Kill a Mockingbird is essential reading. It'll make you angry and sad and hopeful all at once, and if you don't tear up at least once, you might be dead inside. This book gets a solid 7 out of 10 broken arms and one very deadly ham costume.